Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series about the Great Patriotic War. That's the Second World War, and I'm focusing principally on the Eastern Front. I mentioned how the Japanese had attacked the United States, the British Empire, the Dutch, because they ruled Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies, and so forth, in December 1941. Stalin's spies assured him around this time that the Japanese were not going to move against the Soviet Union, which is crucial. There'd been a brief border conflict between Japan and the Soviet Union in 1939, before the outbreak of the Second World War, and Stalin had taken it very seriously indeed, dispatched Zhukov, his top man, who had sent the Japanese packing off across the Amur River. So the Japanese, they respected their Soviet neighbors, because Japan conquered Manchuria, that's northeast China. And Stalin's spies had assured Stalin that the Japanese would not attack in 1941, which is why Stalin was able to transfer a lot of troops from the Far East to Moscow, which had saved Moscow. I mentioned how the Western allies sent some war materials, but sent almost no troops, which is a source of rancor in the erstwhile Soviet Union for obvious reasons, because they were dying in huge numbers. Their civilians were suffering grievously, and they felt that the Occidental allies were not pulling their weight. It's a justifiable complaint. The only Western country to send soldiers to serve on the Eastern Front was France. So remember, there was the Free French. There was Charles de Gaulle, based in London. He was chairman of the French in the Committee of National Liberation. Remember, he wasn't prime minister, he wasn't president. He's just chairman of that organization. So the other allied governments were chary about recognizing him as head of a French government in exile. They eventually did. He was a general in the French army in 1940 when he fled to London, and not the most senior one. Anyway, de Gaulle, though he was anti-communist, he recognized that the Soviet Union was a puissant nation and was going to be even mightier in the wake of an Allied victory. Therefore, it made sense for France to do everything it could to remain on cordial terms with such a powerful country. He thought it was crucial that French would serve on all fronts in this war. So that's why he dispatched a few Frenchmen to serve on the Eastern Front. Thought if they fight in this theatre, we will garner at least a little bit of gratitude from the Soviet Union. The French communist leader was broadcasting throughout the war to his Frenchmen. Remember, the communists in France had urged people to observe the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and to sabotage the war effort in 1939, 1940. Only after June 1941 did the French communists completely change their tune, saying this is a people's war and we must back up the Soviet motherland and fight against the Third Reich. So Maurice Thorez was broadcasting to the French to take up arms against the occupiers and their Vichy collaborators. Maurice Thorez would always end his broadcasts, and the publication said on his name, somewhere in France. In fact, he wasn't. It was in Moscow all through the war, on Bochuga Island, the river Moscow, just south of the Kremlin. You can see a plaque where he was. De Gaulle decided to fly to Moscow, visit Stalin, and fly the flag for France to emphasize French support for the Soviet Union and to reaffirm the time-honored amity between France and Russia. Remember, since the 1890s, they'd been allies against Germany. Indeed, briefly in the time of Napoleon, they'd formed an alliance, but that had fallen apart. So de Gaulle couldn't fly there directly, couldn't fly over Western Europe, because these were Axis countries, or else neutral countries leaning towards the Axis, such as Spain, had to fly a circuitous route over North Africa and touch down in Baku, Azerbaijan, then a Soviet republic. He spent a night there in the Icheri Sheher, the enclosed city, the ancient walled city, and there's a plaque on the building where he spent the night, and then he flew on to Moscow. Planes had never very long range in those days, had to stop to refuel a lot, unlike today. A couple of nights in Moscow, and he stayed in Baku for 2 nights on his way back. So he at least recognized that the war would be won or lost on the Eastern Front. So there were a whole series of Red Army counteroffensives in 1943. Things were going better for the Allies. November 1942 was the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, where the Allies had outnumbered the Germans 2-1. The British, Australians, South Africans, Indians, and so forth had defeated the Germans and Italians. As the British General Montgomery said, we're going to hit Rommel for 6, and they did, with Operation Supercharge, and the Axis forces were certainly soon driven all the way across Libya, back to Tunisia, hemmed in there, The Americans had landed in Morocco and Algeria, these French colonies, in November 1942, got the Vichy French to change sides there. Admiral Darlan, he switched sides. But this posed some uncomfortable questions. If a Vichy leader, and he was a man of fascist opinions as well, was to be forgiven, left in situ, what about Mussolini? It's the Prime Minister of Italy. He was founder of the Fascist Party. Supposing he said, okay, I want to be neutral, or indeed join the Allies, were the Allies going to allow him to rule on? Italian anti-fascists would be aghast. What if Hitler decided to make peace? Was he going to be allowed there? Well, the Allies had quickly decided on a doctrine of unconditional surrender. They would only accept German unconditional surrender. No armistice, nothing like Versailles, all right? Germany would surrender, say, impose any peace terms you want, must be seen to be thrashed. They didn't want a Dolchstoss Legende cropping up again, where many people, Germans after the First World War, said that their country hadn't lost, had simply been stabbed in the back by power-hungry and treacherous left-wing politicians. No. Once the Soviet red banner was planted at the Reichstag, Red Army tanks were rolling down Unter den Linden, there could be absolutely no doubt that Germany had been militarily crushed. It must come to that. The other thing is the Allies didn't quite trust each other not to make a separate peace. The Soviets were chary about the Western Allies that the United Kingdom, the United States and so on might conclude a separate peace with the Third Reich and leave the Soviets to fight on alone, leave them in the lurch again, as Moscow saw it. The Germans counterattacked at the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. It was the largest tank battle ever fought. The Germans pressed forward and found that they drove the Soviets back very easily, looking good for them. However, they were being led into a trap like the Romans at Cannae. They were cut off and surrounded. The Wehrmacht had advanced too far. Their emphasis on speed proved to be their undoing. The Soviets had read the German psychology correctly, and they knew the Wehrmacht's playbook, so they could predict their moves, and they'd learned how to counteract them. Another thing is the British at Bletchley Park had broken the German codes, so could decode all these secret German messages, pass them to the Soviets and others. And even before that happened, sometimes Kim Philby, one of those MI6 officers, discovered what was going on and told his NKVD handlers in London, even before the British government officially passed on this information. There was another German submarine which was sinking in the Atlantic, and it was abandoned by its sailors. The Royal Navy sent some men aboard and managed to get the code book, which was obviously a very audacious thing to do. And had those sailors been slightly slow in getting out of the submarine, those Royal Navy guys would have gone down with the submarine and drowned. But again, it was a vital breakthrough. There's an American film about it which depicts it was the US Navy who did it, which is a fallacy. Anyhow, so the Allies had won the intelligence war. Perhaps the main lacuna in the German war effort was intelligence. They were too ideologically led. Want to believability was their failing. They dropped lots of spies into various Allied countries. They were almost all caught very inept, whereas the Allies, they had turned some Germans to feed back false information to people they caught. There were some German anti-Nazis who were feeding information to the Soviet Union, to the British and so on, things like that. Some neutral diplomats working their way. German military technology was in some regards world-beating. Their vehicles and planes emphasized speed. They had reasonably tough armor in their tanks. Their guns had a good punch. However, the tanks tend to be gas guzzlers. Now, this was not a headache earlier in the war when the supply of oil was plentiful. As the war dragged on, oil supplies grew scarce, and the rate of consumption of fuel by German units was an increasingly severe problem. So how did they deal with this headache? Well, they weren't sensible by designing lighter tanks. There was no point in having a tank if it couldn't move, because then it just became a static piece of artillery or would have to be towed. So German military hardware was superb, but it emphasized quality over quantity. They were too fussy about it. The military kept insisting on design improvements. They kept tinkering with it, and therefore the many different models of the same tank, slightly updated, and often they couldn't find a spare part, because a spare part for the 1939 model wouldn't work in the 1940 model, and so forth. So German technology was too precious. It would only work under laboratory conditions, and conditions in the field were often far from ideal. Couldn't cope with thick mud or extreme cold. Sometimes the engines wouldn't start, got clogged by dust, couldn't go through deep water, couldn't go up so steep slopes. So Soviet military technology was in some regards second rate. But Soviet weaponry was robust. It actually worked. didn't break down very much, was quite fuel efficient, even though the oil was one of the few things that was plentiful in the Soviet Union. So their tanks and their technology in general was hard wearing. It was durable, it could stand up to extreme cold, very hot temperatures, it could plough through very glutinous mud or even go through water. Tanks and trucks were durable, and they were also super abundant. They produced them in great numbers. They were not fancy, they were straightforward though, and they could be produced in unprecedented numbers. The limited range of weapons meant the troops were familiar with all types, and spare parts were very easy to find. So people knew how to repair things. Soviet thinking was the opposite of German thinking when it came to producing weapons. The Soviets favoured quantity over quality. Well, it worked. It was a war-winning stratagem. So even if the German tanks were better than the Soviet ones, when they're outnumbered 5-1, well, you could see who was going to win. You know, if Soviet tanks were a C grade in terms of quality, if it was schoolwork, and the Germans were A grade, that's not good enough if they're far more C grade ones. So that's enough for the moment.